All right, in this one, we're going to talk about the actual cruise that we did. We did the 10-night New Zealand cruise from Sydney. Just want to talk about the pros and cons and what we think now that the cruise is over. I'll start with the pros, and I'm going to go through the ports that we liked and the things that we liked about the cruise. I'm not going to talk about the ship because I'm going to make another video just about the ship itself and what we thought about it. I guess I kind of have to start with a con because of how the cruise started off. So our first port was supposed to be Picton, New Zealand, which we were pretty excited for. In Picton, they have the Queen Charlotte track, which we were planning on going and hiking for the day, but last minute that port got canceled because of the Tasman Sea. The Tasman Sea is known to have big swells, and that is not something that we knew beforehand, but because of the Tasman Sea having big swells, a lot of times the ports on this cruise get canceled. They either get completely canceled or they get changed, and a lot of times you can't even go into the Sounds, which I think is the main reason you would go on this cruise. As we were heading across, we found out that Picton was going to be canceled and swapped in for Taronga. At first, it was like, whatever, kind of sucked. But then once we found out that there weren't really any excursions available. So in Taronga, there was Mount Maunganui, which was interesting to us. So that's kind of what we focused on. But we kept trying to check with the cruise if there was going to be excursions offered because we knew that Hobbiton was close to Taronga. Unfortunately, we found out that there was another cruise ship that was already docked at Taronga, and most of the excursions were already sold out. Now that we changed course, the cruise had told the tour operators that we were coming, and they had set up new tours for people coming. Well, everyone was kind of fighting for those spots, and because they were last minute, they were really expensive. So I think you probably ended up paying double what they normally were just because we were coming into Taronga last minute. So starting off with a couple cons, that was the Tasman Sea is rough. If you're prone to seasickness, you probably don't want to go on this cruise. There's a lot of sick people on this cruise for sure. We luckily didn't get sick, but it still bothered us. There was days when we really couldn't even look at our phones for too long without getting motion sick. So it is pretty bad on this crossing from Sydney to New Zealand, and even when you're going from port to port. And also the fact that this cruise gets stuff canceled a lot. That is just not good. I don't know why they keep trying to go into these tiny ports with this huge ship. Okay, so now onto Taronga. So getting into Taronga was actually super easy. We were able to check out Mount Maunganui. We were able to hike up that and around that, go to Main Beach and go into the little town. And we really enjoyed just spending time there. So that port was good enough to be explored by itself without having to go on an excursion. The next port that we liked was Wellington. So Wellington is the capital of New Zealand. So there's a lot to do. I mean, if you just like exploring cities, we ended up going up the cable car with about 1 million other people, but we also hiked down through the botanical gardens, which was well worth it. We liked that a lot, and just explored Wellington for the day. One more thing I'll say about Ovation and being so big is because it is so big, it has to come into port and leave at certain times, and it has to make sure all these people get on and off the boat. I noticed that out of all the cruise ships, the Ovation was the one that always left earliest, and I think it was because it had to make sure it could get into these ports. So Wellington, we didn't really have that much time, but we did enjoy our time there as well. It takes 2 days to cross from Sydney to New Zealand, so you have 2 days at sea on the way there and 2 days back. And for us, that's just way too much. On our last cruise, we only had 1 day at sea out of 10, and every other day was a port day. So having 4 days at sea, it was just way too much. If you like doing stuff instead of just being on the boat, then this cruise really isn't for you. If it wasn't for Taronga, Wellington, and the Sounds, I don't think we would have enjoyed this trip. The last thing we liked, and I think makes the trip, is the Sounds. And we were lucky to get into them. I think if the swells had been a tiny bit worse, we would have had them canceled on us. The seas weren't that crazy to me. It's just the fact that the ship is so big and it can't fit into those sounds. So we were able to go to Dusky, Doubtful, and Milford Sound, and that was an amazing experience. I think that if you do this cruise, the Sounds is what you're doing it for. Now to the ports that we didn't like. So the first one is Napier. So Napier, we also didn't book something here just because it didn't seem like there was anything that really stood out to us that would be that fun and worth the money. Most of the excursions were $150, $200, $250 each. A lot of them were just driving around the city or driving around the area out just outside the city. We thought maybe we can just see what we can around the area, hike around. Well, Napier doesn't have all that much. There's shops, there's the beach, which is beautiful for a cruise ship. There's just not a whole lot to do there. The places that they took us, including Napier and Dunedin, there just wasn't all that much to do. Dunedin also felt the same, and we also just had the fiasco of not being able to get off the ship very quickly. The Port Chalmers is actually where you go into. It's about 20 minutes away from Dunedin, and with this many people on the boat, it just takes forever to get into Dunedin. So I think in Dunedin, if you're going to get off the boat, you might as well just walk into Port Chalmers or get an excursion in Dunedin, because just going into Dunedin almost isn't worth it. So overall, we did enjoy going on this New Zealand cruise. For us, it was last minute, so we wouldn't have been able to plan a trip to drive around New Zealand or Australia with how late we booked this cruise and this flight. Doing it again, I probably, it's hard to say. I think that the main thing about this cruise is if you can make it to the Sounds, if it doesn't get canceled on you, it's a great way to see those, because there's almost no other way to see them. It'd be much more difficult for you to see them if you tried to do it without a cruise. You'd have to drive really far, you'd have to fly really far, you'd have to take other boats. So seeing the Sounds is worth it for this cruise. But if you got the Sounds canceled, if you got one or two of the ports canceled because of swells, this trip really would not be worth it, unless you love cruising, which I don't think we love cruising. We just like the fact that you can go last minute, you can see some cool places and be in and out. But overall, if you want to see places thoroughly, cruising is not the way to go. That's what we thought of this New Zealand 10-day cruise.